Darn technology. Okay, back to the Venn diagram. I'm going to brainstorm different words. Holy cow, now the lights went off on me. Yikes. Okay, I'm going to brainstorm different words that relate to the set of all possible x values. So these are vocabulary words that I've had you filled out in the past, but they relate to x values. So a variable that relates is the variable x. You will always see x representing the set of all x values. Another vocabulary word that relates to the word x is what's called the domain, or the domain of a function. So the domain is another vocabulary term that relates to all possible x values. Another word or a synonym of domain would be the word input or independent variable. So again, independent variable is the same as the domain, which is the same as the input, which all relate to the variable x. And finally, when we're looking on a graph, so if I draw a quick sketch of a graph in just the first quadrant, when we're looking at the origin, okay, which is right here, the x-axis is where you want to look at or make sure your eyes are looking at when you want to look at all possible x values. Then on the other side of my Venn diagram, I'm going to be writing words that are synonyms of each other or that relate in terms of all possible y values. So for that variable, y is obviously the variable that is important and needing to know. The word range then relates to all possible y values, and it's the opposite word of domain. A similar word to range would be output or dependent variable. And then if we're to look at a graph, again, drawing a quick sketch of the first quadrant where the origin is here, the axis that goes up and down is the y-axis, and that's where I want my eyes to look when I'm trying to find what is the range or the possible range of my data set or all possible y values. So the way in which these words, because they're different, obviously, that's why they're on opposite sides of the Venn diagram, but the way these words relate to one another is either by the word relation and or by the word function. So we need these items on the outside of the Venn diagram in order to create a relation together and in order to create a function together. That's really important to know and understand as we move forward, because as it says down here for your notes, which I'm going to highlight in purple, this note says, please refer back to the notes section of this lesson to remind you how to identify and write the domain and range. Well, in order to identify and write the domain and range, as was covered in your notes and your practice problems of lesson 1.1G part 1, you really need to know and understand these vocabulary terms. That's why the vocabulary in this section was so rich and so heavy, because if you don't understand these vocabulary words, then you're not going to be able to identify and write the domain and range. So please make sure you have a good understanding of these words before you go back and look at how to identify the domain and range. Because what happens is our brain likes to play tricks on us, and when we're looking at a graph, we can get all sorts of confused as to what exactly we're looking at in order to identify the domain and range. So then I'm going to help bridge that gap and that confusion as we move into lesson 1.1G part 2. And in lesson 1.1G part 2, now takes off from, now that you have a basis of what the domain and range is and how to identify and write the domain and range, now we need to tell whether something is a function or not. So with that being said, I made sort of like a T-chart in here. On the left-hand side, I have examples of what we call functions, and on the right-hand side, I have examples of what we call not functions. When we look at the first example here, I have what's called a table of values. Now with the table of values, I can go ahead and use this table in order to plot my points on a graph. So for a table, in order to make an ordered pair, you need an X and a Y value. So when I look at -3, that makes an ordered pair with +2. So on my quick sketch graph, because I'm not using graph paper, I'm going to go ahead and as best as possible put at least 4 hash marks as evenly as I can on all parts of my axes. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab these values. So -3, +2 is right there. -2, 0 is right on the x-axis. 0, -2 is right on the y-axis. 1, +3 is right there. 2, 0, again, is on the x-axis. And then 3, -2 is about right there on my quick sketch graph. So in order to decide whether this table, which now I've converted into a graph, whether or not it is a function, what we are going to use is what's called the vertical line test. And I know this was slightly covered in your notes and referred to in the reteaching part of this section if you ended up watching the video there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a ruler, and what I'm going to do is draw dotted lines with a highlighter through these points. So I'm going to start with my first point, take my ruler, and I'm going to draw a vertical dotted line right through that point. And I'm going to do the same with all of the other points that I just created. What I'm doing right now is applying what's called the vertical line test. So for every point that is in this table, I'm drawing a dotted vertical line so my eyes can visually see it and not play tricks on me. But then to prove to myself that because when I look at all the vertical lines, only one coordinate point appears on that vertical line. So what we say is this function or this graph / table passes the vertical line test. So because it passes the vertical line test, meaning there's only one point for every vertical dotted line, this is a function. So this table is a function. Again, what I did is I took the table and I made more of a visual to help me understand whether or not this was a function. That is then different from a graph that doesn't pass the vertical line test. So on this graph over here, I'm going to go ahead and make 4 even hash marks again. Oh, and my video timed out, so I'm going to go ahead and pause and stop and come up with another video.